Good morning. I hate to stop all this good fellowship, but it's time to start our class. Open your Bibles to Acts chapter 21. Acts chapter 21. We are continuing in our study of the chronological order of the New Testament. And we ended last time with the end of Paul's third missionary journey. He ends up in Jerusalem, and that's where we pick up this morning. In verse 17 of Acts chapter 21, when Paul got to Jerusalem, he had a meeting with James and the elders. He provided with them information about what he had been doing in Gentile nations, the Christians that had been converted. What a great thing there had been going on there. And then he, you remember on one of his third missionary journey, one of his purposes was, as he went from church to church, he took up money to take back to the poor saints in Jerusalem. So he delivered that money to the elders of the church in Jerusalem for them to help out the Christians there. And then they got into a discussion. There were, you have to remember, Paul's main work was not with Jews. Paul's main work was with Gentiles. And there were a lot of Jews in Jerusalem who were Christians who were still zealous for parts of the old law. They were keeping some of the traditions. They were keeping some of the customs. They still paid attention to the feast days and all these kinds of things. And they had gotten an uproar because they had heard that Paul had been telling Jews in Gentile lands not to keep these customs. Now, that's not true. Paul had been telling Jews they could not be saved by those things, that those things were not connected to salvation. And he had been teaching Gentiles they did not have a responsibility to keep the law. He had not been telling Jews they could not keep Jewish customs. Nothing wrong with Jewish customs, as long as you don't bind them and force them on somebody else, as long as you don't make them a matter of judgment. We do the same thing today. There are customs and traditions that we keep, that we understand are not connected to our relationship with God, they're not connected to our salvation, but yet there's still something we like to do. I grew up, just to give you kind of an idea, I grew up in a home and in a congregation in an area where you did not make mention of Christ during the season of Christmas. That was not Christ's birthday. In fact, we made a big point out of the fact that Christmas was not Christ's birthday. I never sang "Oh Holy Night" or any of those songs in the church building, because we couldn't sing them around Christmas because they let people think we believed it was Christmas, and we couldn't sing them in June because everybody thought we were idiots. But we just never sang them. In fact, they weren't even in our songbook when I was a kid. As I've grown up, I found there are a lot of different ideas about whether or not and how you celebrate Christmas. There are some who don't do anything. They refuse to acknowledge that Christmas exists. There are some of us, like me, who celebrate Christmas as a secular holiday. Christmas is a time to get together with family. It's a time to celebrate each other. We exchange gifts. We do all that kind of things. We eat too much. But that's our tradition for Christmas. There are other people, even among Christians, who celebrate that as Christ's birthday. As long as you don't enforce that on anybody else, as long as you don't make that a matter of doctrine, and as long as you don't think that's connected to your salvation, that's fine. Don't make a big deal out of it one way or the other. The only thing I would say is don't bring it into the church assembly. But if you at your home you want to celebrate Christmas is Christ's birthday, that's fine. I heard one guy say one time he celebrated Washington's birthday as Christ's birthday. Whatever you want to do with those things, it's your choice. They're matters of opinion, but the church in Jerusalem was in danger of splitting because of that. Because the church in Jerusalem and the Gentile churches, because the Jews in Jerusalem were keeping those traditions and those customs, and the Gentiles were not. And they're hearing that Paul is telling the Jews not to do that. And so the elders said, we've got an idea. What you do is, we've got 4 men who've taken a vow. Now, I assume this is a Nazirite vow. If you go back in the Old Testament and read about Nazirite vow, you can do that. But at the end of that, when that Nazirite vow came to an end, they went and they offered certain sacrifices and they offered certain worship things to God, and that marked the end of their vow. Now, a Nazirite vow, for however long you took the vow, whether it was a week or 2 weeks or a month or 2 months, however long you took it, during that time frame, you were devoted to God. You did no secular work at all. Everything you did was about your relationship with God. And you did not cut your hair. You didn't have any grapes moisture dry. You didn't touch any dead body, just like a Nazarene from birth, like Samson and John the Baptist were, but this was for a specific length of time. At the end of that vow, you went and offered these sacrifices. And so the elders looked at Paul and said, what we want you to do is we want you to join with those 4 guys. When they go to end their vow, we want you to go with them and participate with them and pay their expenses for taking this vow. And that will show the Jews in Jerusalem that you don't want to get rid of customs. Now, one of the questions oftentimes asked about this, and we studied this Wednesday night several months ago, should Paul have done that? This is my opinion. Understand this. I think he made a mistake. And one of the reasons I say that is because the end of the Nazirite vow was connected to animal sacrifices. Animal sacrifices were done. You have to understand in that first 20 or 30 years between the establishing of the church and how as the church grows and as Christians mature, there's going to be some overlap there. There's going to be some times when people, if you grew up all your life not eating pork, you're baptized, the next day you're going to start eating pork, right? No. Because you've been living that way for 40 years. You've been taught from the time you were a baby that this is something you don't do. This mars your relationship with God. And that doesn't change overnight. And so there had to be a transition period where they worked through some of this stuff. But they were having this issue, and Paul decided to do that. And he decided he would participate in this vow. Now again, I think, Scripture doesn't say this. Get this through your head. Scripture doesn't say this. Roger said it. I think he made a mistake. I could be dead wrong. But that's what I think. But anyway, as this vow is coming to an end, Paul comes out of the temple one day. There are some Asian or some Jews from Ephesus who are in Jerusalem for some reason, why I don't know. But they had seen Paul earlier in the week in Jerusalem with Trophimus, who was a Gentile. They see Paul coming out of the temple, and they jump a big wide chasm. Paul came out of the temple. Paul was with a Gentile the other day. That means Paul took a Gentile into the temple. That ain't so. That ain't what Paul did. But that's what he's accused of. And as they make that accusation, and they start a big ruckus, they go in, they grab Paul, they drag him out of the temple into the courtyard outside, and they start beating him. They're going to kill him. And it just so happened the Roman fortress was right next door. And the head of the Roman army in Jerusalem was a man by the name of Claudius Lysias. Claudius came, when he heard that tumult, he came out of that fortress with some of his soldiers. He saw them surrounding this guy and beating him, and so he pulled Paul out. He saved him. And they started walking up the steps to go into the fortress where he could question Paul. And Paul looked at Claudius and said, "Can I speak to the crowd?" And he gave him permission to do that. Acts chapter 20, or chapter 22, I think it is. Paul speaks to the Jews from the steps of this fortress as they're walking up the steps to go in. At the end of his speech, at the end of his talking, what it does is he raises up another ruckus. At the end of verse 21, he gave the recount of his conversion, how he became a Christian. In verse 21, he said, God said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. That word God and Gentiles threw them into another uproar. And so it says it turned violent, and they were after Paul again. And in order to stop that, the Roman soldier takes him back into the barracks. And the first thing he's going to do is, guess what they did to prisoners back then when they first arrested them and they didn't know what they'd done? How'd they get a confession out of them? They beat them. They would tie their hands over their head, tie them up this way, and take a Roman flog and beat the fire out of them. Now, if you remember Old Testament law, Jews could only beat a man 40 with 40 stripes. So most of the time, the Jews would count and they would stop at 39 to make sure they didn't miss one because they didn't want to go over. They'd rather be one short than one too many. They stopped at 39. The Romans had no such limit. They would beat you till they got out of you what you wanted or what they wanted. They get ready to beat Paul, and Paul looks at the guy that's tying him up and says, is it lawful to beat a man who's a Roman and uncondemned? Paul was a Roman citizen. He had the rights of citizenship. You could not flog a Roman who had not been condemned in court. You couldn't do it. You could flog a foreigner all day long if you wanted to, but not a Roman citizen. And so that scared the guy. He went and told the head of the army, this guy says he's a Roman citizen. And Claudius comes back to him and said, I paid a lot of money for my citizenship. And Paul said, I got mine when I was born. Paul was born in Tarsus. Tarsus was a Roman province, which meant any person born in the city of Tarsus was a Roman citizen. You know, if you're born in Atlanta, Georgia, you're an American citizen. Birthright. That's what was happening here with Paul. I'm a Roman citizen. And so they can't beat him. He's put in the fortress. The next day, Paul decides to take him to the Sanhedrin, or Claudius decides to take Paul to the Sanhedrin. He goes for the Jewish court. The court says a few things, then they allow Paul to defend himself. And Paul uses a little psychology here, because he figures out part of the court is Sadducees, part of the court is Pharisees. What's the major difference between Pharisees and Sadducees? Pharisees believed in life after death. They believed in resurrection. Sadducees did not. And so Paul, in the middle of his speech, says, I'm here because of my faith in the resurrection. And guess what happens? The Sadducean court is split. The Pharisees, boy, this is a great guy. He's done nothing wrong. Let him go. Said, no. He's a horrible guy. And so they start fighting with each other. Paul turned them on each other. So then Claudius finds out that's not going to accomplish anything, so he takes him back to the fortress. At this point, there were 40 Jewish men who took a vow. I am not going to eat till Paul is dead. I am not going to take a bite till Paul is dead. They go tell the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin is the Jewish court of the Jews. They're involved in all this. They go and tell the Sanhedrin, and so what the Sanhedrin decides is, we will send a message to Claudius. We'll ask him to bring Paul back to the Sanhedrin court tomorrow. And these 40 guys on the way to the Sanhedrin, these 40 guys are going to attack Paul and kill him. Now, it ends up being fortunate. This plot is overheard. Somebody else hears it. And the person who hears it is Paul's nephew. How he heard it, what he's doing there, I don't have any idea, but he heard it. And he goes and tells Paul. And Paul calls his guard and says, you take this young man to Claudius. And he tells this young man, you tell Claudius everything you just told me. And Claudius acted very smartly. He got soldiers. In fact, I think there was about 600 or 700 soldiers to take one guy. But they took him to Caesarea, which is where the Roman governor was, and they took him that night. Did not wait till the next morning, they took him that night. So he would be away from the danger of the Jews. And when the Jews came to Claudius the next day and said, we're ready to have him in court again, Claudius simply said, he's not here anymore. I sent him to Caesarea. You want to talk to the governor, you go to Caesarea. You go talk to the Roman governor. So Paul is now out of Jerusalem. Paul is in Caesarea. What's interesting to me about all this stuff, you work through all this, and it really is about getting Paul to Rome. Paul wanted to go to Rome. Paul's going to Rome. Just not the way Paul wanted to go to Rome. Paul's not going on his own. Paul's going under Roman escort. But he's going to Rome. He gets to Caesarea. Felix is the governor. After a few days, the Jews come down from Jerusalem. They make all these wild accusations against Paul. In verse 25 of chapter 24, Paul is speaking to Felix, and Felix says, go thy way, and have a more convenient season, I'll call for you. As far as we know, Felix never had a more convenient season. And I oftentimes stop at this point to make this point. There is no convenient time to obey the gospel, because it turns your life upside down. And there's nothing convenient about that. You stop being Lord of your life, and Christ starts being the Lord of your life. You start living how you want to live and live like he wants you to live. There's nothing convenient about that. He sends the Jews away. In reality, Felix plays the old procrastination game. He knows Paul has done nothing worthy of punishment. But he also knows if he lets Paul go, he's going to make the Jews mad. So he just keeps him in confinement. Felix is there for a period of time. Some have said probably somewhere around 2 years. In fact, I think verse 27 of chapter 24 said 2 years. And Felix is kicked out of office. He's replaced by a man by the name of Festus. I don't know about you, but you know what I think of when I hear the word Festus? Gunsmoke. That's the only time I've ever heard that name, other than here, Festus. But anyway, Festus is now the new governor. The Jews find out there's a new governor, and they take their leaders of the Sanhedrin and a man named Tertullius, who was a lawyer, to Caesarea to appear before Festus to accuse Paul. They again make all of these accusations. Paul looked at Festus and said, I've done nothing wrong. I've not violated the Jewish law. I've not violated the Roman law. And so Festus looks at him and says, let me ask you a question. This is not really a question, but it's formed in the words of a question. Will you go back to Jerusalem and be judged in front of the Sanhedrin with me there? Paul knows if he goes back to Jerusalem, he's dead. Those Jews are going to kill him. They've already made that vow. He knows he's dead. And so Paul does the only thing he can do to save his life. Paul says, I am before Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. If you're not going to do it, I appeal to Caesar. Again, that was his right as a Roman citizen. Every Roman citizen had the right to appeal to Caesar. Now he's appealed to Caesar, he has to go to Rome. He has to. And Festus saying, now I want you to put yourself in Festus' shoes for a moment. He's sending a prisoner to Rome for trial. What are the charges? What's he going to accuse him of? Can you imagine somebody walking in before the Supreme Court of the United States and saying, I'm here for a trial. And they say, for what? I don't know. You look at the prosecutor, what are you charging with? I don't know. Have any idea? Now, it just so happened a Roman king or governor, whatever you call him, by the name of Agrippa, was in town, and so Festus set up for Paul to appear before Agrippa. And he tells Agrippa, this guy's appealed to Caesar, and I don't know what to write. Maybe you could listen to him. Maybe you can give me some kind of an idea. And Agrippa said, sure, he was interested in this thing. So Agrippa, by the way, is the grandson of Herod the Great. The guy that was Herod when Christ was born, this is his grandson. And so Agrippa is there. By the way, I mentioned this before, Agrippa is married to Bernice, who is really his half-sister. So there's some stuff going on in this Herodian family. But anyway, Paul appears before Herod and Agrippa. Now, there are no Jewish accusers this time. Paul's just told to make his defense. And chapter 26 is Paul's defense. He again basically tells his own conversion story. This is what happened to me. This is why I changed. This is why I was converted. Look at verse 19. Paul says, therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. Christ appeared to me. God spoke to me, and so I did what they told me to do. Verse 22, he says, to this day I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses would say come to pass. Verse 24, Festus interrupts. Paul's saying these things, and Festus says, Paul, you're crazy. Now, that's not the way he said it, but that's the gist of it. You're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of mind. You're crazy. You got too much stuff in your head. You're just crazy. And Paul said, I'm not crazy, but I'm speaking true and rational words. For the king, and here he's talking to Agrippa. The king knows about these things. He's the king of part of the land of Palestine. He knows about Jesus. He knows about the way, as they call it. He knows all of those things. And so Paul is not talking to somebody who's ignorant. Talking to somebody who's not a Christian yet, but he's not ignorant. And he says, I'm persuaded that none of these things have escaped his notice. Verse 27, he says, Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? In verse 28, Agrippa said, in a very short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? Some of the older translations says, almost, you persuade me to be a Christian. Agrippa is evidently close to accepting Christianity. Not there yet, but he's close. And I love Paul's answer, verse 29. I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might be just as I am, except for these chains. I want the whole world to be Christians. Isn't that all of our goal? I want to convert everybody. I want everybody to go to heaven. Now, I am wise enough, in certain sense, to know that's never going to happen. You're not going to convert the whole world. But it certainly shouldn't keep us from trying. And Agrippa makes a very interesting statement. Verse 30, the king arose and the governor and Bernice, those who sitting with them. When they had withdrawn, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Now here's the interesting thing. People look at that verse and say, see, Paul should have never appealed to Caesar. But what would have happened if Paul had not appealed to Caesar? Festus would have taken him back to Jerusalem, and he would have been dead. Paul didn't appeal to Caesar out of some sense of personal indignance. Paul appealed to Caesar to save his own life, because he knew the Jews in Jerusalem were that opposed to him. And so Agrippa and Festus both say, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we'd let him go. But he hadn't appealed to Caesar, so he's going wrong. You have to remember There are no airplanes. There are no boats with motors. There are no cars. There are no trains. There are no modern means of conversation. There was only one way, or actually two ways, to get from Syria to Rome. One of them was to go way north and go across part of Europe and then come down to Italy. The other way was to sail across the Mediterranean. Most commercial traffic in that day and age sailed across the Mediterranean. You have to remember, in that day, how did they guide the boat? They didn't. The boat went where the wind took it. You turned the sail in a certain direction to make sure the wind was going into the sail. But if the wind was contrary to you, if you wanted to go this way and the wind was blowing that way, you didn't move. You stayed in port because you got no motor to direct it. It's going where it's blown. And so for the 3 or 4 months of winter, shipping in the Mediterranean was completely shut down. Nobody went anywhere because of the weather. Evidently, this is late in the fall of the year. They leave Caesarea. They go out into the sea. They go a little bit south of Crete. They go to Sidon. They go to Myra. They go to a place called Cnidus, and they go to Fair Havens. There are two different types of boats you could get to sail across the Mediterranean. One of them stopped at every little port. That's the one they got first. It stopped at every port. The other one went straight from where you were, straight to Italy, right across the open Mediterranean. When they get to Fair Havens, there was a small arbor there, but the captain of the ship didn't think that was a good enough place to winter because it wasn't safe enough from the sea. He decides he's going to leave Fair Havens and try to get to Phoenix, which is about 50 or 60 miles further north, but it had a deeper harbor, so the boat would have been safer. Paul tried to talk him out of it. You need to stay right here. Because God has told me if you take this boat out to sea again, you're going to be in trouble. Now, remember, they're trying to travel 40, 50 miles this way, trying to get up to Phoenix. They set sail with the boat. They hit a horrible storm, ended up being blown around in the Mediterranean for 2 weeks, and end up on an island called Malta, which is almost due south of Italy. They crossed the Mediterranean, but not because they wanted to, because the wind took them that way. They get near to this island called Malta, and they run aground, and the boat starts falling apart. It's stuck, part of it's stuck on like a sandbar, and the rest of it's still out where and the wind and the waves and everything start in the back of that boat, and it just starts falling apart. And so everybody that's on the boat jumps in the water. It was shallow enough at that point. They either grabbed a hold of a piece of the boat or they swam to shore. And what's interesting to me is, I know there were probably several Roman prisoners on that boat, because generally they did not take one prisoner alone. They waited till they got a group and carried them at one time. Not a single one of those prisoners tried to escape. They landed on the island of Malta. You remember, if you've read it, the inhabitants accepted them. The inhabitants started setting up a fire to get warm. Paul was gathering sticks to help with the fire. He had a snake come out and bite him on the end. And the heathens on an island are saying, aha, he escaped from that storm. Now the gods are going to make sure they got him. That snake bit him. And evidently it was a poisonous snake. Paul acted like it was a mosquito bite. Didn't bother. And those people going from saying the gods are going to get him to he's a god. This doesn't happen. People don't get bit by poisonous snakes and not have issues. And so he must be a god. And so Paul stopped them. And at that point began talking to them about the gospel. They spent the winter on the island of Malta. In spring, they set sail from Malta. They went to Rhegium, to Puteoli, and then they went to Rome. Where the Bible says Paul spent 2 years in his own hired house. He paid his own rent. He had a Roman soldier with him for that entire 2 years, but he was in his own house.
You left out one very important thing there.
What?
Paul healed the people of that tribe, and God allowed.
Yeah, there was one of the leaders of that tribe, I think, if I remember right off the top of my head, his name was Publius. Had a family member who was sick, and Paul healed him. And that kind of opened the door for Paul to be able to talk about the gospel. And there were evidently some people who were converted there. So Paul gets to Rome. And it's interesting, when he gets to Rome, one of the first things he does is he calls the leaders of the Jews. Come talk to me. So they come talk to Paul. And Paul laid it out before them that the Jews in Jerusalem had been against him and had put him in prison, and that's why he was here. And what the leaders of the Jews in Rome say is very interesting to me. We never heard of you. We don't know who you are. We don't know anything about this rock that you're talking about. Now, what's interesting, the Jews in Jerusalem had been so adamant about making sure Paul was dead. Why didn't they send word to the Jews in Rome that this man is coming? They went all the way to Caesarea to accuse him. Why couldn't they go to Rome? Maybe they thought their case was too weak. I don't. It's just interesting to me. It's a question I don't know the answer to. They didn't show up. Evidently, at one time, Paul had a hearing before Caesar or before somebody else in his household. And at the end of that 2 years, according to traditional history, Paul was released. We'll talk later about what we think about what Paul did during that release period. But he was let go at the end of that 2 years. While he was in Rome, you can read some of the epistles that he wrote, and you can find out while he was in Rome, he was visited by Tychicus, he was visited by Timothy, by Demas, by John Mark, and by Onesimus. Now, Onesimus is an interesting case. Read the book of Philemon, and you'll find about Onesimus. Onesimus was a slave who belonged to Philemon, who ran away. Somehow, I don't know how, somehow ended up in Rome. Somehow got in contact with the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul and Philemon knew one another, and that may be the reason why Onesimus went to Paul, because he knew of his connection to Philemon and thought he might have been. Paul evidently converted Onesimus while he was in Rome. And we're going to talk about the book of Philemon in a moment, but Paul sent Onesimus back home. A very interesting set of circumstances there. While he was in prison, he wrote 4 books. Number 1, he wrote the book of Colossians. Colossians deals a great deal with false doctrine, kind of a mixture of Judaism and asceticism and philosophy and those kinds of, they'd kind of mix all of that up and tried to introduce it into Christianity. He talks about the new man, about love, and about forgiveness. The book of Colossians and the book of Ephesians are very closely related. Much of what Colossians talks about is in Ephesians. Much of what Ephesians talks about is in Colossians. They're very closely related. Secondly, he wrote the book of Philemon. I mentioned this. Onesimus was a runaway slave. He sent Onesimus back. If you want a good study in how to use philosophy and how to use people's feelings to get what you want, read the book of Philemon. Because Paul writes to Philemon and says, Onesimus, I know he belongs to you. I know he ran away from you, and I'm going to send him back home. I really could have kept him. He's really helping me out a lot. I really could have kept him. Now I'm going to send him back, and whatever he owes you, if he's taking him, whatever he owes you, charge to me. Now you think Philemon's really going to do that? You think he's gonna write Paul a letter and say, you owe me $65? No. I could have kept him, but I know he belongs to you, so I'm sending him, he sent him back. And just for a second here, let me make this point. Onesimus was a slave. The Bible, the New Testament, neither condemns nor approves slavery directly. What it does is it put in action principles that if followed, slavery will dissolve in and of itself. Read Ephesians chapter 5, Ephesians chapter 6, where it talks about how slaves are to treat masters, how masters are to treat slaves. If the master and slave operated that way, you would end up not having a master and slave relationship. You also have to understand that Philemon and Onesimus' relationship is now completely changed. Because they're their brothers. They're part of the church. But the way he treats that slave is going to change radically. Now, when a Christian in that day and age owned slaves, the way they treated them was radically different than the way other people treated them. If you follow those principles, slavery will dissolve in and of itself. If the Apostle Paul and other leaders of the church had stood up on a public podium and condemned slavery right off the bat, and had told all those Romans, people who were not Christians, who were pagans, they give up their slaves, the church would have been crushed. Secondly, you have to remember what the purpose of Christianity is. The purpose of the ultimate purpose of the gospel is not to make life better here. The ultimate purpose is to get us to heaven. And that's what you keep in mind. So that's what the book of Philemon was all about. Let me look at the book of Ephesians. These were all written in about 61 AD, and the probability is Ephesians and Colossians and Onesimus was from Colossae. So all three of these letters that were written were probably sent by the same person because they're going to the same general area. There's a possibility of some scholars who think Ephesus was a circular letter, that it was written for all the churches, and that it was passed around, and all of them read it. The theme of the book of Ephesians is Christ in the church. Living right, unity, marriage, the armor of the Christian, those are the major themes that are discussed in the book of Ephesians. Philippians was probably written about 4 or 5 months later. Colossae and Ephesus were over here. Remember, Philippians was over in Europe, over Macedonia. It was probably written at a later time. Gave them an update on Paul and Epaphras was encouragement in the face of opposition, and it gave the correct view of Christ, Paul's gratitude for them, and the key word in the book of Ephesians seems to be joy. It talks a great deal about being happy in Christ. Question or comment? Everybody's walking in. Must be time for me to shut up.